making it through the rain and whatnot outside, the inclement weather, and I can tell people are still coming in and appreciate. Come on, join us in front. You know, it's a pretty full room, actually. Oh, you see, people always want to be back. Didn't you learn in school the best students were in the front row?
Is there a quiz?
Yeah, no, there's no quiz, but you know, it's interesting. You could sit in the back and the place looks very, very full, but if you've got your speakers, and I want to make sure they're very happy today, you look in the front row, and if there are 4 empty seats, they say, God, you didn't really pull them in. But I think people will continue to come in, and I hope you'll be gracious to them as they do. I'm Steve Clemens. I run the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation, and I think this is an exciting and important program we're going to have today that wrestle through some issues relating to a new report and looking at counterterrorism strategy. The partner for today's event is our friends at the UN Foundation. Where's Kathy? Kathy Calvin, the Executive Vice President of the UN Foundation, is with us today, and I've asked her to say a few words just about our partnership and about this project.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Well, we're happy to be here. We love partnering with the New America Foundation and Steve. It always brings a level of sophistication, energy, and forward thinking that we like to do in all of our work, and we know that's what Steve does. This project started for us as we were thinking about how to work toward the next administration and ensure that whoever comes into office, there is preparation for understanding that all the big issues, ranging from health to terrorism to climate change, are looked at in the prism of this country working together with other nations and multilateral institutions as we formulate our policies. We've loosely titled this "Don't Go It Alone." We've actually tested that in polling, and we found this is something that resonates a lot with Americans. They are tired of our country being out there in a unilateral fashion, and they're really looking for policies that don't go it alone. So we're delighted that this is the third in the series. We've released 2 already, and we look forward to this one being as exciting a discussion and policy making as we've done in the past. I just want to introduce Deb Derrick, who runs the Better World campaign, and Nicole Saurin, who works with her and have put this whole program together.
Great.
And thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate it. And I also want to just to highlight something that Nicole and Deborah have done that I would tell you. There's a website called onday1.org, which is really cool. I know you're all busy, but we do spend a little bit of our time, increasingly, according to Pew, spending more and more time surfing the web. So one site you should go to is onday1.org, which the Better World campaign has all sorts of personalities on the right, the left, the middle, the forwards, the backwards, talking about if they were able to encourage the next administration to focus on an important issue, what it would be. It's a great collage of different ideas and perspectives, but what's nice about it is each of these clips, and I have one, is a minute long. And there are many, and I would encourage those of you who have a chance to go take a look at it. Many of the staff and fellows and researchers, writers at the New America Foundation have participated, but the breadth that you've reached in this and the different personalities are important, because I think it is important to kind of reach out into different pockets of public policy and look at it. So I wanted to pay tribute to Deborah and Nicole for that. So we're going to discuss today the release of a new report, Building Global Alliances in the Fight Against Terrorism. And for those of you watching on the web, these are webcast, you can go to the UN Foundation, am I right? And you can download this entire report, and we'll make sure that when we post this after the fact that the link is up as well. This report was prepared by Alistair Millar and Eric Rosand, who are both here today. Alistair is the director of the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation, which is a nonpartisan research and policy institute working to improve internationally coordinated responses to the continuing evolving threat of terrorism. Eric Rosand is a senior fellow at the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation, also a non-resident fellow at NYU's Center on International Cooperation. Previously, Eric served as chief of the Multilateral Affairs Unit in the Office of Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the U.S. Department of State. I've read the report. I look forward to wrestling through it and raising. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm sure many of you do as well. But before we get a chance to do that, Steve Cole is our new, I shouldn't say, I'm tired of saying new, is our now not so new but important president of the New America Foundation, a Pulitzer Prize winning author about terrorism in the Middle East. He's just released a brand new book entitled called The Bin Ladens, wrote the book Ghost Wars. and former managing director of the Washington Post, and he's been a great leader here. He's going to offer from his perspective comments on this report, and that I will moderate a discussion afterwards. So, Alistair, would you like to go first? Alistair Millar.
First of all, I want to thank you, Stephen and Steve, the New America Foundation, for hosting us here today, and for all of you for coming. It's wet out there, and I feel like a wet puppy up here. But and also want to thank the United Nations Foundation and the Better World Campaign. We've had a good, close relationship over the period that we've been producing this paper. We've done some meetings with the candidates, and this is hopefully one in a couple of presentations that we'll be able to give highlighting this report. And to get to the discussion and not go over every point that's in the report, because you have it here, and as Stephen said, you can download it, I thought I would just go over 3 points and then turn it over to Eric so we can have some time for some discussion. And the first one is really almost stating the obvious, and that is that, you know, the threat that we're facing, the terrorist threat that hit us on 9/11, is transnational in nature, and therefore requires a global response. And I'm not the only one to say that. Of course, the President himself has said that. Michael Chertoff, the Secretary for Homeland Security, has made this point very clear that, you know, we're living in a global world and society. That means that there's links between train and rail links and the internet and all sorts of things that, of course, make our lives much easier, but also make it easier for terrorists to operate across many different nations. And we know, for example, from recent attacks, particularly those that occurred and were foiled in London last year, that it wasn't just attackers coming from Leeds and Birmingham, parts of Britain, but they also had connections with other operatives in places like South Asia. People in the Middle East have been involved as well, and we can say the same for many of these other transnational attacks that have occurred. So the real point here is that there needs to be a nuanced and well-coordinated global response. The administration at the moment has taken put the label global on the response, the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, which is very heavily focused on the military. But it's mainly been a sort of a la carte approach, asking other states to do what the US want them to do, which of course is necessary to an extent, but it hasn't really built partnerships and gone truly global by working through institutions that will help, I think, to sustain what is going to be a longer war. People are now talking about this being a much longer war than perhaps the one that we characterized after 9/11. The second is related to that point, and that is the issue of burden sharing. If we work with the international community, you know, we recognize America as the world's strongest military power, and as of the time of the writing of this report, they were the world's strongest economic power. Don't know if they are still. But they have a lot of might, a lot of power, and a lot of reach, but they don't have enough money to really shoulder the burden of this massive global responsibility. So therefore, it's important to work through institutions such as the UN, regional organizations who have a better sense of what local threats are and what people need and how to tailor those on the ground. And the amount of money that is being spent on certain parts of the so-called global war on terrorism does not leave very much money to cover lots of areas where states need to build capacity. And I'm not the only one who's saying this. The Council on Foreign Relations produced a report a couple of years ago that said very, very clearly, you know, we need to work carefully to build the capacity of states to deal with just one issue, and that was the threat of financing terrorism, and that there are groups of states that have been identified that remain weak, that need support, some of which are outside the United States sphere of influence, and we really need to engage through institutions, including the UN, and with functional organizations such as the Financial Action Task Force, such as the World Customs Organization, in a web, a seamless web of interaction and coordination that will be more effective than sort of just bilateral relationships. And then the third and final point I want to make is with regard to how resources are allocated. You know, the threat of terrorism, I think, is one that pervades so many different parts of our lives in terms of how we deal with it from a prevention perspective. I'm speaking specifically about the problem that many Europeans have faced in recent years with regard to radicalization. You know, we can have a strategy to go after those who attacked us on 9/11, but that will only be, as some people have said, like a game of whack-a-mole, unless we have a strategy to prevent terrorism as well. And that means through development, that means working on education and issues like that. And again, I'm not the only one saying this. I found it quite interesting to hear the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, say just soon after he took his position, I think it was in March, he said, you know, the military is overstretched, it can't do this all on its own. We need to look more at a wider, more comprehensive strategy that works more closely with other parts of our government. And I think that applies also across the world, that we need to work through institutions that can help to allow the United States to tackle some of these problems of recruitment and radicalization that are really beyond our own reach. And we're seeing that, for example, in recent assessments by the GAO on the FATA region, the area that is in Pakistan technically, but sort of between the border of that and Afghanistan. And you can have a military approach to one extent, and that is necessary. But you also need to work with local communities on the ground. And working through the UN, for example, where Pakistan is a member state, and working with organizations that are affiliated with the UN, such as UNESCO, the UN Development Program, you can have a much more effective a program, I think, than just doing it alone and bilaterally. And I'll just note, finally, that the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which was passed by 192 states in September of 2006, lays out a pretty good framework for doing that. It deals with 4 different areas, the first being what the UN call causes conducive to the spread, conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. Many people call that root causes. The second is measures to combat terrorism. This will be the work that's been done really since 9/11 at the behest of the UN, which Eric will talk, the US, which Eric will talk about, you know, in dealing with border patrols, controls and financing and what have you. The third is capacity building. And then the fourth and an important one that runs all the way through the strategy is respect for human rights. So there's a framework there that I think offers a quite useful counter-narrative to that of the global war on terrorism in a way, because it involves all states. It's not just one state asking others to do something. It involves more states than just the Security Council, which initially acted after 9/11. So there's more buy-in, and I think covering more areas like that help to address not only the issue of stopping terrorists after they've attacked, but also addressing them before they do it as well. I'll now turn it over to Eric, who will talk a little bit about the extent to which the US really engaged with the UN after 9/11, and then get to just a couple of the recommendations that we highlight in our report, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair, and thanks. I echo Alistair's thanks to the New America Foundation and the Better World Campaign for putting this together. And I thought, just continuing on Alistair's remarks, I would talk about 3 issues. The first, where the comparative advantages of the UN might lie, particularly from the perspective of Washington in a global counterterrorism effort that is and will continue to be dominated by regional and local actors. And second, how the U.S. has failed to take full advantage of what the UN and other multilateral bodies can offer in this area. And finally, the steps that a new administration could take to strengthen international counterterrorism cooperation, including by reasserting U.S. leadership in the UN and other multilateral fora. And let me turn to the comparative advantages of the UN. And many U.S. policymakers and counterterrorism officials often underestimate the UN's role in counterterrorism. And in doing so, they tend to focus on its continuing inability to define terrorism and on what the global body cannot do, which is serve as a vehicle for information sharing and for facilitating operational counterterrorism cooperation. And they don't pay much attention or enough attention to what it has done and can do to reinforce national and regional efforts to address the multidimensional terrorist threat. And the fact is that there will always be a great deal of international counterterrorism activity that will not involve the UN. It will take place regionally and bilaterally. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the UN to play to reinforce those efforts. And I'm going to tick off a few of the areas where I think the UN can, and in many cases does, contribute. First is sort of the most obvious one, and that is in global norm setting. It's adopted 16 international treaties that criminalize nearly every imaginable terrorist offense, and it allows, facilitates international, these treaties facilitate international legal cooperation. And of particular importance in this area, the UN works at the regional level often, bringing local prosecutors, judges, and other law enforcement officials together to build networks of trust and cooperation in the context of training them on how to adopt the necessary laws and implement those laws to give effect to these international treaties. Second, the UN has a convening power that is often underestimated in this area, and it offers a forum for cross-regional sharing of information and experiences on a range of thematic issues related to addressing today's terrorist threat. And this is an area that has been underutilized again by the UN member states. And third, different parts of the UN system, whether in areas such as development, human rights, education, or children, can contribute to addressing some of the so-called root causes that may give rise to terrorism, whether it be the lack of rule of law, failure to respect human rights, or political and social and economic marginalization. And fourth, the UN's seal of approval can offer legitimacy to a wide range of CT programs and initiatives, thus reinforcing the efforts of the US and other countries outside the UN. And for example, as Alistair alluded to, in Pakistan, the UN could offer the US the necessary platform and legitimacy for building a coalition and contributing to a broad-based multilateral plan to reinforce a new US counterterrorism policy towards that country. And this, in our view, could help not only overcome the stigma currently attached to bilateral relations between Islamabad and Washington, but the growing skepticism and distrust among many Muslim nations and communities in and beyond South Asia. Fifth, the UN can provide a universal assessment of how countries are doing in their efforts to combat terrorism, something that would benefit all governments. And it is well placed to identify common shortcomings and challenges in different parts of the world that it's seeing and identify ways of addressing them, drawing on what it's learned in its overviews of other countries and other regions. And sixth, for some countries, having the UN rather than one of the major bilateral counterterrorism players, such as the US, provide advice on their counterterrorism efforts may be much more politically palatable. The reason is that for many, the UN is seen as objective and politically neutral, and it's not associated with the US-led global war on terror. And in short, many countries are more likely to adopt the necessary counterterrorism norms and measures if it's the UN rather than just the US and the EU doing the advocating. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, the UN can contribute to the development and promotion of a narrative to counter the one of hate and violence being espoused by extremists. It can do this through its promotion of peace, tolerance, dialogue among cultures and religions, and far-reaching efforts to address some of the social, political, and economic marginalization that is part of the reason young people are turning to violence in different parts of the world. So that's a general, not comprehensive overview of what the UN might be able to offer. In some cases, it's already it's playing these roles. In other cases, there's a lot more room for improvement. And let's now look at the post-9/11 U.S. efforts to engage the UN. And there you see, following 9/11, building on the wave of sympathy engendered by the attacks, the U.S. had tremendous success in reaching out to the UN, in particular the Security Council, in getting to help globalize the response to Islamic terrorism. Multilateral institutions were to figure prominently in the U.S. strategy, and with terrorism at the top of the U.S. agenda, it sought to make counterterrorism a priority for basically every intergovernmental body in which the U.S. Was a member. And in many cases, the U.S. Began to push for the adaptation of Cold War institutions to allow them to address what had now replaced the Soviet Union as the preeminent threat to the United States. And over the past 6 years, however, U.S. attention to this crucial element of counterterrorism policy has significantly dwindled. More attention and the lion's share of our national security resources are being devoted to the war in Iraq and to bilateral counterterrorism partnerships, and not a single U.S. ambassador in New York, for example, has shown any real interest in the counterterrorism portfolio, leaving the impression that Washington is simply paying lip service to the role of the UN in this area. And unfortunately, the U.S. continues not to fully appreciate how a Security Council-driven effort would be seen by most countries as a proxy for the U.S. global war on terror, and thus undercut the effectiveness of the Council's initiatives. And it has failed to use the UN to promote a broader response to the threat, for example, by using it as a place for engaging with traditional and non-traditional allies on a range of counterterrorism issues. And what should the new administration do? And again, our report highlights a number of these steps. And because of the well-known missteps in the war on terror, a new administration will need to make strengthening international cooperation, including by reasserting U.S. leadership in the UN, a top priority. And increased U.S. engagement with the UN and its member states in this area needs to start with a willingness to listen and an open mind as to how the UN can best reinforce a global counterterrorism campaign. And a new administration needs to identify ways in which to engage with as broad a range of stakeholders on this issue as possible at the UN, while keeping U.S. national security interests in mind, obviously. And sticking with the traditional way of doing business within the UN will not necessarily serve the U.S. interests on this issue. So an open mind on how the UN should be structured to handle this issue, I think, is a necessity. And again, our report offers a few recommendations, some rather modest, some more far-reaching, which, if implemented, would help show the world that the U.S. is serious about reinvigorating its commitment to international cooperation, multilateralism, and the fight against global terrorism. And these include the appointment of a White House czar for international counterterrorism cooperation to help ensure more coordinated and effective U.S. engagement with bilateral and multilateral partners, and calling for the establishment of a global anti-terrorism organization, including possibly under the auspices of the UN. And among its other advantages to the U.S., such a broad-based body, which could come in many forms, shapes, and sizes, would provide a forum for the U.S. to show its commitment to multilateral rule of law-based approaches to combating terrorism and enable it to work better and more effectively with both its traditional partners and non-traditional partners. And this would lend greater legitimacy to its own counterterrorism efforts. And if the U.S. took leadership in this initiative in promoting the establishment of a body, it would go a long way in our mind to reassuring other countries that the days of U.S. unilateralism in addressing the terrorist threat are a thing of the past. And before I conclude, I just want to say that, obviously our paper and these talks focus on strengthening the role of multilateral institutions in the context of U.S. counterterrorism policy. But by no means should this be seen as an attempt to put the UN at the front of U.S. national counterterrorism policy. Rather, it's never going to be the tip of the spear. It's going to be undergirding the continuing emphasis on military law enforcement and other U.S. national instruments of power. And we think by having this multilateral veneer underneath it will only strengthen those approaches. So it is our hope that with these comments and these, our paper will stimulate a serious discussion on these issues. Some will agree, some won't agree. We understand that, but we think these kind of issues need to be debated and more seriously than they have been over the past 6 or 7 years. And we hope this is one of many opportunities to do so. So we look forward to hearing your reactions.
Thank you very much. Steve Cole. Steve, I wonder if I might ask you to
Want me to stand up?
stand, just for the you can sit here afterward, but for the video.
Okay.
If you can be at the
Will do.
wave to our video watchers, our web watchers who decided not to bear the reign, the challenge.
I'll be brief. I'd like to first thank Alistair and Eric for bringing forward such a thoughtful framework at a critical time. I do think that the United States is just beginning a discussion about how to recalibrate counterterrorism policy, and that this is a terribly important discourse that I hope will intensify and become richer through the summer and the fall. And so I thank Better World Campaign and both of the authors for their efforts. I would just perhaps briefly offer a sort of analytical framework in which to see their arguments, one that I think supports all of the thrust of their observations and recommendations. But I would set my framework in reference not just to terrorism, which is the language that they've understandably used, but in reference to the particular problem of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda an organization, also a network, also a movement, also a brand, so we accept that it is not a monolithic subject. But in my view, the paradox that Al-Qaeda presents as an adversary at the time that the United States embarks on this discourse about a recalibrated policy, the paradox is that Al-Qaeda since 9/11 has failed politically but succeeded in its messaging. So it has failed politically because it has not acquired the access to states or political parties or governed territory that it aspired to, or I think certainly some of its leaders hoped it might acquire by now. But it has succeeded in its messaging because it has created a call and response and a narrative about its imagined war and its imagined cause that far exceeds what I think any of its leaders might have reasonably forecasted 10 years ago. So this is a paradox of its achievements. It's also a paradox that then constrains U.S. policy because there are multiple challenges present at the same time. And let me just take two or three and then use that to kick off our broader discussion. As Alistair observed, Al-Qaeda does present short-term threats. I don't know what an international lawyer would say, but my reading of the open source evidence is that Al-Qaeda, the revived organization along the Afghan frontier, as manifested in European conspiracies, does present a clear and present danger to American lives and interests. So there are short-term threats that require a clear-headed and forceful response. At the same time, a strategy of long-term containment and success is not likely to proceed from the same instruments as the short-term response to that clear and present danger. In fact, the political failure of Al-Qaeda lights the path to its long-term defeat, and that is substantially an intra-Islamic contest that is already underway and in which Al-Qaeda's political failure is partially a reflection of the progress of that contest. So part of the challenge for U.S. policy is to recalibrate so that while protecting U.S. lives and interests in a clear-eyed way, it also creates conditions in which Middle Eastern and South Asian governments and populations can succeed in the contest in which they are already well underway, rather than creating conditions that tend to interfere with their progress in that contest, which I would argue is too often the case currently. So that's the context in which I would place this role of multinational instruments, because it is precisely a vehicle for such a long-term strategy. It creates both substance and communications strategies that would enable Al-Qaeda's, the final extinction of Al-Qaeda's political appeal, which, as I say, I don't think is the most difficult objective ahead of us.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. I'd also like I'd like to open the floor, but I'd like to sort of pose a couple of questions. I always, in these, Deborah knows that I spent some time getting to know the work and thinking of John Bolton. And so I often say, well, if I were to get John Bolton to come here, he wasn't available today. How would he approach some of these questions? But I want to weave in a little bit of a narrative. I chaired a session recently where one of the individuals on the session had been an aide to David Petraeus in Leavenworth when they were working on the, I guess it was the U.S. Army Counterterrorism Manual, which is apparently publicly available. You can go down and buy it. There was some discussion at the time on whether to classify it. And fundamentally, the reason that that's not classified, and you can go pick it up at Kramer's, and it's about this thick, quite sophisticated approach, is that it counts upon NGOs, other governments, AID officials, and others to sort of know what the game plan is. And part of it is that's thus far one missing element in the American strategy in publicizing this is getting lots of other players to read it. So, and thus I think what you're doing is important. I also think it's important to broaden the stakeholders in this discussion. But this individual shared something with me which was sort of a shocking data point, which is that there are more people employed as musicians and marching band folks in the Department of Defense than there are Foreign Service and USAID officials out in the field. It's a remarkable data point, and it raises the fundamental question and a critique. And this isn't the John Bolton critique, but it is the nonetheless critique. In your 4 primary goals, 3 of which are clearly designed at American strategy, you seem to be addressing the need for pivot points in government of individuals who could raise attention, as opposed to looking at resource allocations in sort of a systemic problem in reaching this. And again, back to this military official, he said one of the real interesting things is in counterterrorism, 90% of the deal is non-military, 10% is military. And so Department of Defense has huge resources, and yet that is 10% of the problem, so that it dominates, in fact, the discourse. And whereas you made reference to the non-military dimensions, when I read the report, I'm not sure, and I read it briefly, I didn't yet get the feel that you had a benchmarked, sort of sophisticated approach that would draw people into saying we need a lot more thinking and a lot more benchmarkable progress in the 90% that gets underserved in the counterterrorism discussion. So maybe we'll open there and then invite other folks too. And then I'll ask the John Bolton thing at the end.
Thank you, Stephen. The problem that we have at the moment with resource allocation is that you have people going up on the Hill, many of them with medals across their chest, who are still operating, at least in the minds of those who are on the Hill, out signing off on the money in this war framework. And if you have military people coming up, they actually are garnering more money and able to compete more effectively for resources than the civilians in the State Department. And as I mentioned in my brief remarks, there's a sea change occurring, I believe. Some of it is driven by Nagel and some of these others who've written this counter-insurgency manual.
I didn't mention his name, but yes.
And there is some forward thinking going on, but unfortunately it's not seeping across to other parts of the government, including, in my view, the very top level within the State Department. It's very interesting to note, for example, that you've had Robert Gates, you've had Michael Mullins, as I mentioned, say, we can't do this all, we're at breaking point, we need to get back to our core task of being a military and not doing all these other things. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I have a sense that Condoleezza Rice isn't willing to step up and compete for those resources. And one reason that we sort of structured our recommendations around personalities and positions, if you will, is we feel that is probably the most effective way to get those resources back, is to have people who, you know, we've seen time and time again in other parts of government, when you have someone who's a tour de force in terms of their personality and their charisma, and they really have a sort of very serious mandate that they're really fighting for, then the resources will come. And they're competing, I think, not against the military directly, but against those in Congress who still feel rather enamored by the Pentagon's approach to it. And quite frankly, I think they're behind the curve. Perhaps we'll see that change over time, but it's a very good point that you raise.
Okay, let me open the room to questions. Yes, right here.
Yeah, I'm Mike Kraft. I was the counterterrorism officer 19 years ago with this resource issue. Part of it, as Alistair mentioned, the issue on the Hill, but it's also the last few years, even after 9/11, OOB has chopped off the funding request by State Department for its anti-terrorism training assistance program and some of the Justice Department programs. So it's also a problem within the executive branch, not giving enough priorities. Then the appropriators on the Hill tend to chop things off because they tend to look at things last year's baseline. And one appropriator said to me when I asked how come they pushed up money for one thing on the other, said, well, we got more letters on subject X strategy and counterterrorism. So there's the effort of, or the aspect of whether there's a constituency. And the other issue that you raised, Alistair, which I think is correct in terms of personalities, et cetera, it just drives it. But I just, being a little bit of a devil's advocate, when you talk about appointing a White House czar for counterterrorism cooperation, how this would really fit in with the State Department role without getting duplication and dealing with the fact, and Rand can probably talk on this much better than I can, if the White House doesn't have the resources for the day-to-day, you know, getting the cables out and the management, et cetera. I mean, at least traditionally, NFC has not been very, you know, well or widely staffed for that. So I think there's a resource issue there too that has to be dealt with.
So the question, just for the video, is really how would this appointment of a White House counterterrorism czar manage in a competitive environment with the State Department and other potential conflicts? How do you make it work, if that's fair? I'm sorry that that's brief, but I'm giving you an abbreviated version.
I think the answer to that is the State Department has been largely ineffective in trying to coordinate the interagency process on this and in delivering a coherent and effective message to its partners overseas. And part of that problem is that within the State Department, counterterrorism is marginalized. The Counterterrorism Bureau is marginalized compared to the regional bureaus. So the idea of putting the focal point in the White House would not only essentially give the State Department more of a role and raise the profile of this issue across the government. And in terms of the resource question, my understanding is that the NSC has certainly beefed up its operational capacities over the years, and it's not clear to me that by having the czar, quote unquote, in the White House, that the State Department wouldn't still have a key role to play. It would just simply be to for the public and for our partners overseas, a point of contact that's in the White House, that is visible, and that speaks on these issues, ensuring a unified presentation by the U.S. government.
I just want to add one thing to that, and that is that we've seen in other countries, in Australia they call it a whole-of-government approach, we see it in the UK, they call it a joined-up approach. What we're seeing in those countries in dealing with the threat of radicalization that I mentioned earlier and the need to address some of these underlying causes is actually empowering someone as a leader for counterterrorism in the UK or Australia or Sweden and other places to actually ensure that there's more resources allocated across the board than rather than just to one department. So perhaps with a czar in place, going in with that mentality that we need to sort of spread the resources out a little bit more, Mike, you might actually see the State Department getting more of the resources than it's had since 9/11.
But the British government, if I'm not correct, I've spent some time with folks reconstituting, has done a massive change. It's almost sort of a whole psychological shift in which the leaders in government have changed everything from the language with which they talked about this and tied it to domestic outreach to minority communities within the region and connected it to intelligence and the hard aspects of it. I mean, it's a fundamental paradigmatic shift that synthesizes all of that. And one of, again, I want to go back not dominate, but one of the really interesting questions is, while I look at that and then I look at the question of what would your component pieces of this be? DNI, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, DOD, which in this own administration have fought and wrestled over who owns what aspects of intelligence, who owns what facts of public diplomacy. How do you get Department of State and Homeland Security to agree on who should get visas? And the humiliation questions that get connected sometimes to how, I mean, there seem to be management issues that are solvable even without a czar that we're not solving. So one of the questions is, by adding a czar, do you solve any of the dysfunctional questions that we have today that really aren't even resource-based? But without you answering that, let me go back in the very back. Yes, sir.
And Michael McDowell, I have a question for Alistair Millar, and it ties into what you were just saying. There's an extraordinary amount of depth in terms of experience in Britain over 3 decades, particularly Northern Ireland, the IRA, and so on. And I have the impression here from the research I've done that the best practices back there, that there's a resistance here to factoring in those best practices and using them. And I'm wondering if you found that when you were talking to interviewees, when you were putting together the report, because it seems to me there's a lack of priority setting in terms of threat, risk, etc. And there's a wealth of experience back there in counterterrorism, and also in Iraq with the British Army in terms of how it's responded. So there's a deficit in practice here. Is that because there's a resistance to it?
So the question is, again, for those watching online, is there, in your interviews, is there a resistance to the kind of best practices template that the British have used? And to some degree gets back to Steve Cole's question of, to some degree, the difference between near-term kind of hard application of security issues and the sort of mid to long-term that might actually move us forward. Did you find resistance to those sorts of methodologies?
I I think there was resistance initially, but I think one thing that needs to be pointed out, first of all, is that the UK made a heck of a lot of mistakes over the period of 25, 30 years, and they've learned from those. But sometimes I find people from the UK saying to the US, "Hey, you need to do it our way. It's been 6 years, get it together." Well, it took a long time in the UK to develop some of these, to calibrate their own strategies. But I actually think there is a change going on within the US government. For example, in Homeland Security, they are paying a lot more attention to outreach to certain communities, the issue of community policing, working more closely with Muslim communities and other things, which I think takes note of the fact that what happened in the UK could happen here. There was some, resistance at the beginning. People say, no, that's unique to the UK or Europe, it wouldn't happen. But I actually now see a change that Homeland Security is devoting resources to working on civil liberties and issues like that. Because going back to Steve's point, the British hit a brick wall. I mean, they had very, very sophisticated intelligence capabilities to an extent, but they weren't able to reach into communities. And they found after the 7/7 they needed to do a lot more work that didn't involve the classic departments of government, but meant going into those communities in Chapel Hill and Leeds and places like that. And I actually see maybe not as many resources because there's not the sense of urgency in this country yet, but I do see a movement towards that British approach, and I think that's very positive.
Harlan Ullman? Use your lungs, Harlan. We have a trade-off between sound and air conditioning, which is a hard choice we're making, so use your lungs.
The two panelists, given the examples of DNI and Homeland Security, which I think have made the situation worse, what makes you think the U.S. government, no matter who was president, was capable of dealing with these issues in a sensible way, besides optimism? And for Steve Cole, I wonder if you could expand on your view that Al-Qaeda has lost politically or is not doing well. In the context of Zhou Enlai's reference to the French Revolution, it's too early to tell.
So the first part of the question is, what gives you confidence in the next presidency to be able to tackle some of these issues, given what we've seen in our own near-term experience? And secondly, to Steve Cole, could you expand a bit on Al-Qaeda's political state?
I actually don't think. I actually do not think that this administration has attempted in any meaningful way to address the problem that we raised in our report, the fundamental problem, which is engagement with a range of multilateral players around the world. It's been very ad hoc and taken a backseat to bilateralism. And so I don't have any confidence that a new administration can effectively address the problem. But I have some confidence that if these issues are highlighted enough in the next few months, that a new administration can be encouraged to try to. And I don't think this current administration has even sought to. So we don't suggest to be, we're not suggesting that these ideas that we have are going to overcome the massive bureaucratic problems that DNI and DHS have either created or exacerbated. All we're suggesting is that some of these recommendations might more effectively allow the U.S. to deal with its partners overseas to some extent. But I think even a small improvement would go a long way from where we are today.
It's a big question. I'll try to give a short answer. I think there are two ways that you could have measured al-Qaeda's political achievements based on the goals of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and the Egyptians. The Egyptians would have measured those goals in reference to apostate states and al-Qaeda's ability to overthrow or at least penetrate them. And they're making no progress. In fact, they're going in the wrong direction. Bin Laden had always a more sort of Leninist vanguard's idea of his role to provoke a very broad uprising in the Islamic world. And by that measure, not only has he failed, but all of the metrics that you would measure such an uprising by are also going in the wrong direction. Now, are those processes reversible? Well, of course, all things on the in the face of, in human history are, but I would argue that those failures are innate to the current al-Qaeda leadership's unrealistic and millenarian approach to their own strategy. so that the only way that al-Qaeda could evolve into a politically viable organization or movement, such as Hezbollah or Hamas, would be after the decapitation of its current two leaders and some succession process that over years essentially changed their whole strategy. And so in that sense, that becomes a different al-Qaeda, at least in my, perhaps you could say my argument is circular because I'm defining al-Qaeda by its current leadership, but that's...
Is this going to be a Steve Cole article called "The Day We Take al-Qaeda Off the Anti-Terror List"?
Well, yeah, a couple of generations of events between now and then, don't you think? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Shelley Williams, Osgood Center. If you're going to write your memo to the next president, assuming it's a Democrat, how would you ask that Democrat to deal with the political vulnerability that the other side is going to take when you say we want an enhanced role for the UN? Because it seems to me the political environment may support going alone, but it's going to create a vulnerability with.
So this is what will John Bolton say, right?
sort of stealing that thing. But I think it's a very important, because the new administration wants to get off on the right foot and do the right thing. Involves public diplomacy, involves speaking to the American people in a different way than they have thus far.
I mean, can I piggyback on Shelley's comment? I mean, part of what you're advocating the UN needs to do, development, peace, love, fuzziness, all that, is to some degree what their role has always been. So the fundamental issue is, what do you actually do in the United Nations to fundamentally transform or change the effectiveness of an institution? Because I think you could argue that pre-9/11, the United Nations was engaged in many of these activities, didn't preempt the world we entered, and now the question is, how do you somehow ramp up both the sense of consequence that the UN can have in these issues and deliver in terms of sort of some benchmark, public goods, international public goods that the UN is seen as providing, so that's along that line, because John Bolton's comment would be, UN has always done this, always been effective. I would disagree with him. I think it's a miscasting and mischaracterization, but it's clearly what he would say.
Well, just on the first question, I'll let Eric tackle the second part. I think that is, it's very clear that there needs to be sort of two approaches here. One that deals with going after those who attacked us, and we need to keep on course with that. We need to go after these people and capture them, and there's some law enforcement there, and there's some military there, and there's obviously a lot of intelligence work that needs to be there. And I think it needs to be absolutely clear for whoever the next president is that they will keep that focus there, but not have a singular focus. The second part is the prevention issue. And as I mentioned in my remarks, you've got to have a calibrated approach that deals not only with going after those who attacked us, but trying to prevent those who may do it in the future through radicalization and recruitment. And you can only do that effectively if you have an approach that works with the international community, that takes a tailored approach to working with different regions who understand the threat better than we do. I think one thing we have to overcome is the notion that America knows everything about everywhere. So that would be the argument I would make, is not to stand down from the sharper end of the spear, as Eric said, but to say that there needs to be a handle on the thing too. You've got to have some direction and a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I would just, if one doesn't buy into the comparative advantage list that I ran off, which I think is relatively uncontroversial, the issue is trying to get the UN to do those things better. I think all those points that I raised, one can make a strong argument as they will reinforce what the U.S. is trying to do without resulting in a loss of U.S. sovereignty or U.S. control. But I think the fundamental thing that a new administration needs to do when it looks at counterterrorism in the UN is look at how it's being handled and how the Security Council just reinforces all the bad things about the U.S. war on terror. And if the U.S. continues to make the Security Council the focus of its counterterrorism effort up there, it's going to not only lead to nothing, but it's going to lead to negative. It's going to have a negative impact because it's just going to further tarnish the U.S. perception, the image that the U.S. has. And I think, again, the case that we've made in terms of comparative advantage is rather straightforward. It's not talking about ceding U.S. national interest to the UN. It's simply creating a forum where the U.S. can further its national interests more effectively, and that forum doesn't exist right now. So,
Steve?
I'll just answer your John Bolton question more directly, in that I think the effect, if not the intent, of U.S. engagement or lack of engagement with the United Nations on counterterrorism since 9/11 has been to obscure the common interests that UN member states on the whole share in this, against this adversary and in this long-term campaign. And so one of the advantages of Eric's recommendations at the UN is simply to restore the underlying shared interests and to make those visible, and by making them visible, make them self-reinforcing. And that has been one of the broad failures of the United States at the UN, I think, over the last 4 years.
Yeah.
and I think
As long as you speak into the mic, but push it away.
Just to reinforce what Steve is saying, if you look at U.S. bilateral relationships with Indonesia, Pakistan, and Egypt, on counterterrorism, they don't get much stronger. Yet, in the UN context, it's polar opposite. In the UN, they can't agree on anything on counterterrorism because they never really try to. They don't take it seriously. The U.S. does not take it. They just assume that Pakistan, Egypt, and Indonesia are going to be adversaries of a U.S. position on counterterrorism in the UN, which, to me, is not an assumption you should be making if you're trying to engage with these countries in a broader range of Islamic countries around the world.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Fanusi, and I'm from Africa, and I belong to several organizations. But I think generally I don't speak in this type of setting. I usually just listen.
Glad you are today.
But today it's a different thing, because I'm looking at what you're saying about this. You're on number 10, page 10, and I'm saying, well, I belong to an organization which will be doing certain things in Africa in a few years, which you have become know about. How do you define when we take a domestic political action of a particular government in Africa, and we decide, if we do decide to go after its supporters who are blocking us, will you consider us terrorists?
So the question is really activists, in this case Africa, page 10, what's a terrorist and what's, I suppose, a freedom fighter or, socially approved insurgent?
I think, the issue of what's a freedom fighter versus who's a terrorist is not just a problem for countries in Africa, and in fact, one of the roles the UN can play is obviously at the normative level in making it clear that politically motivated violence against civilians is wrong and is a crime. And the distinctions between freedom fighters and terrorism are probably not valid anymore. That said, the UN can also be an effective advocate for ensuring that countries don't use counterterrorism as an excuse for going after what's legitimate political opposition. And again, this is an area where the UN can, in its normative role, make a difference. It's just a question of whether countries like the United States want to maximize the UN's effectiveness in that role.
I just want to add one thing, and that is that, with the UN having actors on the ground, it has and the relationship the UN has to African states versus the US, there's a better chance of getting fundamental things done that will help the efforts against terrorism that don't necessarily have to have that label on it. Improving borders, improving institutions to help deal with prosecutions and things like that in the name of stopping transnational crime, an issue that's important to the UN as well. Compare that, okay, to what is a noble effort but will be perceived in exactly the opposite way, in my view, to AFRICOM. AFRICOM will be stood up supposed to be in around November of this year. And to be fair, they put a lot of work into ensuring that there's a civilian leadership in there as well, and that it's a kind of gentler command, if you will. But the perception in Africa of the U.S. military taking the lead and enlarging its presence in Camp Lebanon offers a different counter narrative to what you're suggesting.
Isn't it better to have the UN in those cases dealing with these issues than having what is perceived to be a heavier hand of Africa in a post-colonial continent with all sorts of ideas about the way the British and the US and others may act?
It's a hard struggle. I mean, I just was thinking the other day about, Condi Rice's notion that, comment that it's embarrassing that Nelson Mandela is still on a watch list for us. I mean, it is, you get into, these are hard to wrestle with, and part as you surface them. But yes, in the very back.
Edison Dick, United Nations Association, to sort of follow up with this question. Is there any possibility that the overall UN Convention on Terrorism will ever come into force? And if so, how important a tool will that be in this fight?
So the question is, will the UN Convention on Terrorism ever come to force, and how might it, or how might not?
The UN Convention that you're talking about is obviously hung up over the disputes on who is a terrorist and who's a freedom fighter, and it's intimately linked to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think when there's a resolution of that conflict, you might see a resolution of this issue. So I wouldn't hold our breath. But one thing I would like to say is that if
maybe if we all held our breath, it might get solved.
But then there would be no need to, because we'd all be dead. The importance of that convention, I think, is often understated, and that obviously it would be politically significant. But in terms of legally, right now a lot of legal cooperation that could be useful across borders between countries in investigating, pursuing, prosecuting terrorists doesn't take place because there's no legal mechanism for it to take place. But if you had a global definition, a global law enforcement convention like this that covered a panoply of terrorist offenses, basically, you would have that framework. So as a practical matter, I think there is value to continuing to pursue this. But the problem is countries basically don't take it seriously anymore. They just assume that there's this impasse that's never going to go away. And neither the EU, the US, nor countries in the Islamic world have invested much in the last couple of years in actually trying to resolve it. They just bring as many lawyers into the room as possible and try to sort of figure out how to, change one word here and there in the language of the convention, and hopefully you'll get an agreement. But it's obviously a political issue, and it needs political leadership to resolve.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Pete Mayer, Near East South Asia Center. My question to you is, what if there is no domestic American buy-in? What you're proposing is a whole new approach to prevention of radicalization, and in addition to traditional CT efforts. However, at this point in time, we're seeing a slight isolationist trend in American society. And we're in 2 wars, been there for a while. We're in the middle of a recession. What if the political leadership or how can the political leadership convince the American people that not only is business as usual not cutting it, but we need to go forward with development issues and such, and not regress backwards through a more isolationist point of view?
So the question, again with the camera, is what if there's no domestic buy-in because of isolationist pressures?
Well, that's the president's job. I mean, the president has to take priorities and convince the American people that those are important priorities. And I think you can.
So is this your on day one video?
Yes. So it's really up to the president to show some leadership. And as Eric, I think, quite clearly showed, after 9/11, there was buy-in. The president took some real action to work through the Security Council and wore that badge pretty proudly. But it tapered off because his interest and those around him dwindled. So I think as long as you have political leaders that aren't seized with an issue, you're not going to have the public buy-in on it.
And just one other thing, I mean, last time I checked, the whole notion of change is pretty prominent in the election discourse, and our argument is basically that this is one aspect of change that should be promoted.
What does change mean? Any other questions? Well, I want to thank Eric Rosand and Alistair Millar, Steve Cole for joining us today. I want to thank the UN Foundation. I'm going to get Rand Beers, who's sitting out here, to pose a question one of these days here, because he's very intelligent, smart, wrestling through these with the National Security Network here in town. I want to thank Deborah Derrick and Nicole, my staff, Samir Lalwani, and others for those of you joining us. So we look forward to the future reports. Good luck with this, and we'll look forward to having you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.